Christianity teaches that the law of Moses is no longer needed. The law in Judaism is called Torah. Torah is the most important part of the Bible, according to Jewish belief. Well, in Christian belief, the law of Moses serves more of a symbolic function, mainly to show us that the law is hard to keep and therefore we need Jesus. To investigate this subject, I want to look at both parts. What is it that Christian New Testament teaches, and what does the Jewish scriptures say that we find in Tanakh? So, for starting, I want to look at the basic doctrine why Christians believe there is no need for the law of Moses. This idea comes from the letter of Paul. Paul had great influence in the New Testament, not only now, but also when he was spreading the news of Jesus the Messiah. In Galatians 3:24-25, Paul says the following:
Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster, to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith is come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster.
As Paul seems to teach, as long as we believe, we do not need to keep the law. We have learned from it, and now we can do without it. This is his main message. Paul will go further in his teachings. It's not just the replacement of faith, but the law itself is a ministry of death. Yes, death. We read it in the second letter of Corinthians 3:6-7.
Who also hath made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. But if the ministration of death, written and engraven in stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away, how shall not the ministration of the Spirit be rather glorious?
Well, we see that Paul tries to convince that the law is bad and it should not be practiced, because no one is able to keep the commandments. We find this idea also in the book of James. Here we find the core teaching of the New Testament. Why the law of Moses is bad? Because the assumption is we can't keep the law of Moses.
For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend on one point, he is guilty of all.
Because whenever you sinned, you are not a righteous person. This troubled me, because aren't we created by God in this way? That we can make mistakes and learn from our mistakes? And do we raise our children in the same manner? Whenever a child makes a mistake, he's always bad? That sounds depressing. So, after investigating the Jewish statement of this, I discovered that David was a righteous person. And we read it in Psalm 32, which David wrote after his sin with Bathsheba, that David confesses his sins. And he was considered righteous. Here we see a righteous God that forgives, and, please note, God forgave without the shedding of blood.
Of David, a psalm. Praiseworthy is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is concealed. Praiseworthy is the man to whom the Lord ascribes no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no guile. Psalm 18:20-24. And he brought me forth into a wide space. He delivered me because he took delight in me. The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his ordinances were before me, and his statutes I will not remove from myself.
So, back to the book of James, where we generally find that faith alone is not good enough. It is faith and deeds. Yet, Paul is saying only faith. James will go further by saying you need both.
James 2:20-24. But wilt thou know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? Seest thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. You see then how by works a man is justified, and not by faith only.
After reading James and then reading Paul, we find that they differ in opinion, whether it's faith or work, which is interesting, I think. James clearly teaching something beyond the lessons of Paul. But what about Scripture itself, Tanakh?
Genesis 18:19. For I have known him, because he commands his sons and his household after him, that they should keep the way of the Lord to perform righteousness and justice, in order that the Lord bring upon Abraham that which he spoke concerning him. Genesis 22:18. And through your children shall be blessed all the nations of the world, because you hearkened my voice. Genesis 26:4-5. And I will multiply your seed like the stars of the heavens, and I will give your seed all these lands, and all the nations of the earth will bless themselves by your seed, because Abraham hearkened to my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my instructions.
Galatians 3:6-11.
Even as Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, know ye therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. And the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, In thee shall all nations be blessed. So then they which be of faith are blessed with faithful Abraham. For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse, for it is written, Cursed is every one that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God. It is evident, for the just shall live by faith.
Genesis clearly states that God says, keeping my commandments, my statutes, and my instructions. Paul clearly denies it all. How is it possible that Paul, who claims to be an observant Jew, as Paul does in Philippians 3:5-6, but is not capable of quoting Scripture?
Circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, according to the law a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, as to the righteousness before the law, blameless.
Because when Paul is quoting Scripture, he leaves out parts, or sometimes he replaces parts. We find a clear example of this in Romans 10:6-8.
But the righteousness which is of faith speaketh on this wise, Say not in thine heart, Who shall ascend into heaven? Or, Who shall descend into the deep? But what saith it? The word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth and in thy heart. That is, the word of faith which we preach.
When we compare them to Deuteronomy 30:11-14, it becomes visible that these quotations are not fully accurate, but enough to convince a not Jewish traditional crowd, just like his audience.
For this commandment which I command you this day is not concealed from you, nor is it far away. It is not in heaven that you should say, Who will go up to heaven for us and fetch it for us, to tell it to us so that we can fulfill it? Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, Who will cross to the other side of the sea for us, and fetch it for us, to tell it to us so that we can fulfill it? Rather, this thing is very close to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you can fulfill it.
So, Paul leaves out the most important part, so that you can fulfill it. And no, it does not say so the Messiah can fulfill it. It's not there. Paul alters the message of God to his people. Well, he probably wants to make his new movement more attractive. He did not realize that these commandments are here for our merit, not to show us how bad we are, but for us, as we see here in Deuteronomy 6:25.
And it will be for our merit that we keep to observe all these commandments before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us.
But it's not only that. The Jewish scriptures are clear about what is good and what we should do. We read about it throughout the Tanakh.
Exodus 19:5-6. And now, if you obey me and keep my covenant, you shall be to me a treasure out of all peoples, for mine is the entire earth. And you shall be to me a kingdom of princes and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel. Deuteronomy 7:9-12. Know, therefore, that the Lord your God, He is God, the faithful God, who keeps the covenant and loving kindness with those who love Him and keep His commandments to 1,000 generations. And He repays those who hate Him to their face, to cause them to perish. He will not delay the one who hates Him, but He will repay him to his face. You shall therefore observe the commandments, the statutes, and the ordinances, which I command you this day to do. And it will be, because you will heed these ordinances and keep them and perform, that the Lord your God will keep for you the covenant and the kindness that He swore to your forefathers. Deuteronomy 26:16-18. This day the Lord your God is commanding you to fulfill these statutes and ordinances, and you will observe and fulfill them with all your heart and with all your soul. You have selected the Lord this day to be your God and to walk in His ways and to observe His statutes, His commandments, and His ordinances, and to obey Him. And the Lord has selected you this day to be His treasured people, as He spoke to you, and so that you shall observe all His commandments. Psalm 103:17-18. But the Lord's kindness is from everlasting to everlasting, and His charity to sons, of those who keep His covenant, and to those who remember His commandments to perform them.
Well, there are many, many more examples in Tanakh. These are just a few. Psalm 119 is filled with almost every verse about the beautifulness of the law. It is presented as a gift. Paul is clearly editing. He copies from what he sees fit, according to his own beliefs. But, according to the writer of Matthew 5:17, we see that Jesus taught otherwise. Well, we may never know what Jesus really taught, because Jesus never wrote something for Himself, which is problematic.